I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Galen, Matt, Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, G, Tilo, Emilia, Jeremy, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Gareth, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Will, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H, Y. Kellerman, Sadeed 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. On this edition of the program, we'll be hearing from Matt McManus about his latest book, The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. But before we get into that, I'd like to remind you that it is you, the listener, that makes this show possible. I have no corporate sponsors, so if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. This show is entirely listener funded. You are the ones that make this possible. With that out of the way, Matt McManus is a political scientist, and his new book, the aforementioned Political Theory of Liberal Socialism, may come as a surprising title. After all, a lot of people on both the left and the right would say, what do you mean liberal socialism? Liberalism and socialism, they're completely incompatible. Well, Matt has a provocative argument to make. He says the space between liberalism and socialism, or at least certain strands of liberalism and socialism, are not as far apart as some might think. More on that in the conversation to follow. With that being said, let's get right to it with Matt McManus. Welcome back to Parallax Views. I guess that I've been trying to get on and my schedule hasn't always allowed for it. We've been trying to set this up for a while. Matt McManus, author of The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism. How are you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Happy May Day.
Indeed. So getting into this book real quick, I don't want to start with the usual question that I hear you asked, which is, well, define liberalism and define socialism. I want to start with something before that, which is, how do you go from doing critiques of the right wing to something that's more of a, I guess, more positive vision? You're trying to come up with something rather than critique something in this book.
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess there's a serious and a non-serious side to this. We'll start with the kind of non-serious side. So my wife and a lot of my friends have always been asking me, when are you going to write about something that you actually agree with, rather than just, hate reading, Dugin and Bap and all these types. And I've always said, yeah, I'll get to it. I'll get to it. Yeah, I'll get to it. And at one point I was just like, fine, I guess this is the time I'll actually do something positive by writing about people that I actually admire and tend to agree with. So part of the product, that was the book. But the more serious reason is when you dive into right-wing thinking, what you see persistently is this claim amongst right-wing intellectuals that there's actually quite a bit less difference between liberalism and socialism, certainly than many liberals and socialists believe. Now, there are crude versions of this, the kind of Stephen Miller, Ben Shapiro, Mark Levin type, everything that's to the right of Ronald Reagan is communism, socialism, liberalism, postmodern neo-Marxism, etc. That's not what I'm engaging with. But there are more serious thinkers like Nietzsche, Heidegger, down into the present day people, excuse me, like Michael Oakeshott, all of whom stress that there's a deep elective affinity between liberalism and socialism in the sense that both are Enlightenment humanist doctrines committed to a certain conception of liberty for all and equality for all. And so reading the right quite a bit, in no small part, inspired this book, I guess in a negative sense of the word.
Now we have to get to that dreaded question of defining liberalism and then defining socialism. I know you get asked that a lot in interviews about this book, but it seems pretty foundational.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So one of the things that I stress in this book is that it makes a lot more sense to talk about liberalisms and socialisms plural than just one ideological doctrine that's defined by certain very rigid parameters. Liberalism has been around, depending upon who you ask, for at minimum 250 years. Some people would even go as far back as really the beginning of the 17th century, which means that we're coming on in about 350 years. Socialism, can be dated back to the beginning of the 19th century, although, of course, again, there are antecedents that you can trace all the way back to Plato, if you really have a mind to do so. And in that time period, these are families of views that have meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So what I argue in the book is that liberalism from a normative standpoint is largely defined by a commitment to two, perhaps three principles. This idea of equality for all, which leads to a commitment to freedom for all, and then potentially to this idea of solidarity or Republican fraternity. And that's, of course, the famous triune principles that are associated with the French Revolution, arguably the most famous of all liberal revolutions. And of course, all liberals have understood equality for all, liberty for all, and potentially fraternity or solidarity for all in very different ways, right? And many liberals have actually argued that equality for all doesn't actually need to include equality for most of the people on the globe, just those who are worthy of being identified with equality. And socialism, I argue, is committed to a very similar set of normative principles. Basically, the idea being that the free development of each should be a precondition for the free development of all. And the reason for this is that if we were to establish a society where people are more equal, they will also be more free and more capable of developing their fundamental human attributes and doing so in solidarity and in fraternity with one another. And what I point out in the book is understood at this normative level, one can see the conservative point that there's really not as much space between liberalism and socialism and as one might expect. Although, of course, again, the devil is in the details. And as I point out in the book, there are certain strands of liberalism that are a lot more compatible with socialism and certain strands of socialism that are a lot more compatible with liberalism than others.
So I have listeners from all across the political spectrum, ranging from like libertarians to socialists. And I think both the libertarians and the socialists will say, well, no, liberalism and socialism are completely different from each other. So where could there be overlaps, or where are the schools of liberalism that may have affinities for socialist thought?
Sure. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned that. Those kinds of responses were pretty much exactly what I got when I first announced this book, all the way back in 2023, I guess. Interestingly, the two groups that were most vocal in opposition were the kind of hard and tankies and the neo-libs and libertarians. Don't often agree about much, but they did agree that the idea of liberal socialism was just, at best, oxymoronic, at worst, insulting. But what I point out is it's neither oxymoronic or insulting. Actually, if you look at the history of liberal and socialist thought, some of the most prestigious and most important figures in those traditions identified with liberal socialism, defended it, and indeed thought it was the most inspiring vision for a flourishing human future. So in my book, I trace the origins of liberal socialism to the thinking of Mary Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine. So just to go a little bit back before then, I talk about how when liberalism emerged onto the world in a kind of ideologically developed form, it was really stamped by what C.B. Macpherson calls the features of possessive individualism. This idea that we should view society from a fairly atomistic collection of individuals, each competitively looking after their own self-interest. Ideally, the state will provide a set of rules, law, right, so that while we're competing with one another to advance our self-interest, we don't end up killing each other. But ultimately, that's going to be a fairly moderate form of social solidarity and other orientedness, agreeing to respect everyone's rights as guaranteed by the law and no more. And within those kinds of parameters, each person is going to be essentially a little inquisitor and a little entrepreneur, right? Spending their life trying to get as much stuff as possible to gratify their hedonic urges as robustly as possible. And I want to point out, without a doubt, there are strands of liberalism that conform to this possessive individualist model, right? You just have to go look at somebody like Ludwig von Mises in the Austrian school, for example, although there are complications there as well. But what I point out is that in the writings of people like Paine and Wollstonecraft really start to see a different set of ideas emerge about what's going to be entailed by liberalism. So just very briefly on both figures, Thomas Paine, some people might know, is the famous revolutionary who was associated with the pamphlet Common Sense that was widely read by the American revolutionaries and was hugely popular throughout the 18th century. And when he wrote Common Sense, Paine was a pretty standard kind of American revolutionary, very steeped in, if not Locke, at least Lockean themes and Jeffersonian themes, talking about the need to destroy the aristocracy, replace it with a Republican and representative system of government that respected natural rights, etc., etc. But by the time he got to writing his famous book, The Rights of Man, particularly the second part, Paine came to the conclusion that, in fact, classical liberalism didn't go far enough in challenging existing relations of power and domination, particularly those predicated on inherited wealth. And he argues quite innovatively that actually what you might broadly call the Lockean school of thought or the possessive individualist school of thought was wrong in seeing property, particularly expansive private property, as a natural right. He in fact insists that there are certain natural rights to property, but treated seriously would mean that most property was held in common or be widely distributed by people. Private property of the sort that we see in society right now is very artificial. It's socially instituted, and it, for the most part, benefits the rich rather than the wide majority of people who live in society. And Paine said, since property of this sort is very clearly a social right rather than a natural right, and it is held by the rich, to the detriment of the poor. The rich owe the poor an enormous debt for the maintenance of their property rights, which will be paid through an extensive redistributive system that is going to be very generous, according to Paine, by 18th century standards. It's going to include things like universal education, a pension system, guaranteed employment of a high level, right? This isn't, working in Scrooge's working Stooge's grindstone, right? You're going to live a pretty flourishing life. An inheritance that everyone receives at birth, that kind of thing, right? And Paine only became more radical on this point as time goes on, especially by the point where he's writing things like agrarian justice. And he has very nasty things to say about what might happen to the rich if they don't actually institute his program. Then on the other hand, you have people like Mary Wollstonecraft, right? Wollstonecraft is most famous for her classic feminist tract, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Deservedly so, but she's a lot less discussed as a political theorist generally. And if you actually engage her works like A Vindication of the Rights of Man or her later letters from Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, what comes through is a figure who is deeply concerned about inequalities in property and insistent that we need to do something to change this. So in A Vindication of the Rights of Women, just to give an example, she insists very strenuously in a kind of Rousseauian Smithian vein that it's as if from a poisoned chalice from the divisions of private property flow as though from a poisoned chalice almost all the destructive qualities of human civilization. She thinks that the division of private property, especially inequitable divisions of private property, tend to make people avaricious, envious, and perhaps worst of all, it makes the elite class of any society contemptuous of those below them, even though purportedly these are the people that they're supposed to be ruling. Now, Wollstonecraft never actually developed a thorough political philosophy because she died quite young at 38. But she does insist throughout her work that a more equitable distribution of property will help people cultivate liberal and republican virtues. And by the time you get to her letters from Scandinavia, she's actually characterizing the kind of nouveau bourgeois class as a fungus that's spreading across Northern Europe, by and large useless, right? But she says they're nonetheless having a pretty corrosive effect morally on society, because she says, at the very least, the aristocrats of the Ancien regime would sometimes cultivate the sense of noblesse obligée towards others that would soften some of their cruder features. She says the new bourgeois class that's emerging cares about nothing but making money and sees the highest goal in life being acquiring as much money as possible, and looks upon anyone who argues that there might be something more to life than being as rich as possible with an enormous amount of suspicion. And she claims that if this nullity, this kind of emptiness, becomes pervasive, then boy, oh boy, are we going to be in a lot of trouble. So in Paine and Wollstonecraft's writing, you really start to see in germ, I argue, the kind of ideas that are later going to evolve into a distinctly liberal socialist tradition.
So I want to stick on Wollstonecraft and Thomas Paine for a second, but in a different kind of way. There's another figure, their great rival, that you mention a number of times in the book. I think I counted 95 different mentions of him, Edmund Burke.
Sure.
So why is it important to look at Edmund Burke in contra to Paine and Wollstonecraft? What can we get out of looking at this sort of rivalry there?
Well, that wasn't an idea that was original to me, actually. Credit where due, and I cite this book. Yuval Levin, in his book, The Great Debate, kind of prototyped that distinction, or sorry, that bifurcation. In his book, The Great Debate, he basically says you can see the origins of the modern left and right in the Burke-Paine debate. So I thought that this was a smart idea. It helps clarify not just the time period, but certain kind of contemporary streams of thought. So why not shamelessly replicate Levin's bifurcation? But the important reason is because Burke, much like how Paine and Wollstonecraft, I argue, prototyped a lot of the ideas that are later going to become characteristic of liberal socialism, and for that matter, the broader left, especially Paine. Burke assembled in germ, essentially a textbook of almost all the different kinds of arguments and rhetorical strategies that the right is going to use to this day in order to try to argue for inequality, hierarchy, deference to traditional kinds of authority, all that kind of stuff. And what I point out in the book is that Paine and Wollstonecraft were very aware of this, right? They were deeply interested in Burke's writing because they recognized its originality and its importance as a classic early on of conservative literature. And they themselves developed, I think, very effective ways of arguing against these canonical conservative arguments that are going to go on to have a long shelf life. Just to give one example that both Paine and Wollstonecraft make fun of, and that's the only way to describe it. Burke, at various points in Reflections on the Revolution in France, insists that the illusions that hold society together are nonetheless extremely important, and we should do our best to retain faith in those illusions, lest we tear society asunder. And by the way, the term illusions is his term, right? This isn't me kind of bad-mouthing him, right? Or treating him in bad faith. He says all the pleasing illusions are to be stripped away by these revolutionaries, and that's a terrible thing. And he said, by contrast, in order to kind of prop up the illusions that hold society together, particularly the illusion that hierarchy is necessary, ordained, and is not to be challenged, he says it's extremely important for you to ascribe sublime qualities onto the people who are going to be elevated over one another. Because whenever one man is elevated over any other man, it helps it go down a lot easier if you assume that the person who's going to be elevated over you isn't just some schlub who happened to be born into the right family. It helps if you think, well, he's Louis the 16th, the Sun King, right? Or the descendant of the Sun King, ordained by God to rule over the majesty that is France. And Burke also insists, again, or he's very clear, right? These sublime qualities don't actually have to be intrinsic to the people that you attach them to. They're kind of rhetorical form of sublimation that it's necessary to indulge in if you're going to attach people to the hierarchies that are going to subordinate them and even compel them or inspire them to defend those hierarchies if they're pushed to do so. And Paine and Wollstonecraft are just remorselessly critical of the irrationalism and the kind of slavish brown-nosing that they associate with this idea. Just to kind of quote Wollstonecraft for a second, she says that you can search through Burke's writings, particularly The Revolution in France, day and night, and looking for arguments. And what you're going to find is only that he has, as she called it, a mortal antipathy to reason. And if there's anything like argumentation that actually makes up his defense of the Ancien regime, it amounts to we should reverence the rust of antiquity, because even if it's a decaying system, it's still the one that we were born into. And we should love it with a kind of filial attachment. The way that a son looks at his father and says, "Well, you might be flawed, but you're still my dad, and I'm still going to listen to you." And Wollstonecraft says, "What a ridiculous idea, right? First off, king is not your dad; he's the king. And secondly, right, any sensible person would say the ivy may well be beautiful, but if it's cutting off new growth, who would not chop it out in order to allow healthier sprouts to emerge?" And Paine was very similar, right? When talking about Burke's constant kind of bombastic pontifications, he says Burke is the kind of person who will care for the plumage of France, right? The aristocracy, and nothing for the dying bird, right? All the people and the peasants in France who are ruthlessly exploited by their so-called betters. And that's because for Burke, everything operates at a surface level, right? The aristocracy is beautiful. Marie Antoinette is, the genteel queen of France who needs to be reverenced, but the actual ordinary people that make up the country, who clearly were tired of being ruled by their so-called betters, they just never really factor into his analysis in any meaningful way, even though they make up the vast majority of the population.
So, in regards to liberal thought's evolution over time, I think what socialists have an issue with, I mean, there's many issues that socialists would have with liberalism over the decades, and just over the years. But one is the sort of blind spot it has towards socioeconomic inequality. Can you discuss that tension, and where do you see those tensions coming up in debates within liberalism and amongst liberal thinkers over the decades and centuries?
Sure. Well, that's a great question. And I think, without a doubt, socialist critiques of liberalism have a lot of gas in the tank, right? And I want to be very clear. The book is not a hagiography of the liberal tradition or a defense of the liberal tradition against socialism. In fact, it's not even necessarily a defense of liberal socialism. I point out there are a lot of gaps and a lot of problems with the tradition that need to be fixed if people are going to meaningfully retrieve it for the future. But, to be clear, the crude, kind of tanky accusation that liberals just don't care carte blanche about socioeconomic inequality, or for that matter, domination by economic forms of power, is just wrong from a historical standpoint. Now, without a doubt, there are some streams of liberalism and certain canonical liberal thinkers who could be criticized in this way. Just to give one example, Ludwig von Mises, the kind of arch Austrian economist, is kind of the villain of the book, and he makes it very clear that we have little reason, if any, to care about inequality. The only equality that we should be committed to is equality under the law. Any inequalities that emerge in a market society are absolutely justifiable and cannot be challenged, both for economic reasons, because it's efficient to allow these inequalities to persist, but also for moral reasons, right? He argues that any kind of concern with inequality is invariably motivated by envy, and also that in a capitalist system, the best, the hardest working people end up rising to the top, and they should not be condemned for acquiring as much as they can because they've contributed an awful lot. Just to give an example in his own words, he wrote a famous letter to Ayn Rand, right? Ayn Rand, famous lady of the people, around the time of the publication of her book Atlas Shrugged, where he says, "You have the courage to tell the masses what nobody else will do in this era of the welfare state, which is that you are inferior, and all the improvements in your life that you've witnessed are due to people who are better than you, right? And if it's a hard pill to swallow, then you should still swallow it, right?" So a very elitist kind of figure who, without a doubt, belongs in the liberal camp, right? But I point out in the book that while these forms of liberalism that kind of sneer at concerns for economic inequality are common, they're by no means exhaustive, right? Just to take two examples that I gave earlier, Paine and Wollstonecraft were both deeply concerned, not just with inequality from a political standpoint, but also from a moral standpoint, right? This kind of corrosive effect that inequality had both on the ruling classes and on the lower orders, and argued for a more egalitarian distribution of goods in order to offset that. And I argue that by the time you get to someone like John Stuart Mill, who's in many ways the first liberal socialist, concern with economic inequality is very, very pronounced in his thinking. He constantly points out, especially in his later period, that inequality is ugly. It produces a society that looks an awful lot like the Ancien regime that liberals committed themselves to destroying. And he points out that this extends into the workplace. At various points, Mill says, look, liberals once prided themselves on destroying the basis of indentured servitude in the ancien regime. This kind of scraping, brown-nosing attitude that peasants had to take whenever they encountered the Lord, saying, yes, sir, thank you, sir, may I have another, sir, that kind of thing. But he says that his contemporaries never really seemed to be all that concerned that a very similar kind of attitude was introducing itself in the bourgeois workplace, where people go to work because they're dependent on the capitalist who runs the workplace. The very same kind of servile attitude reintroduces itself. And Mill said, we should not be willing to countenance this as good liberals. If we are concerned with eliminating the slavish, brown-nosing attitude that appears in the ancien regime and replacing it with a more egalitarian system, then we should be absolutely committed to doing the same in a capitalist system. And Mill has many other arguments, including economic arguments to this effect, right? He says that by and large, the capitalist class doesn't really do very much that's valuable in society. Yes, they provide a little bit of technical know-how that's valuable, but nothing that workers under ideal conditions wouldn't be able to provide for themselves. For the most part, they get a lot of money handed to them, and then they don't do very much that's valuable with it, right? Or they indulge in lavish vanity projects that aren't exactly an especially efficient allocation of money. So Mill argued that far preferable would be a system of what we might now call market socialism, where different firms would be owned by workers and run by workers. They would compete with one another, yes, in a market, but because the means of production were no longer owned privately, but by the workers themselves, he said this could be justifiably characterized as a form of socialism. And all these reforms would be accompanied by a very generous redistributive state that would provide basic necessities for all people from a very young age through to the grave, right? And whatever you think about this, and I have problems with this specific vision of liberal socialism, you can't say that Mill was just unconcerned with inequality. If anything, he was deeply critical of other liberals who thought that there was just no reason to be concerned about this. And bluntly, it's hard to think of a more canonical liberal than John Stuart Mill.
So I know you've mentioned the term tanky a few times. I won't use that term just because I know it's loaded, but where do you think, I guess, hardline Marxist-Leninists have a good critique of liberalism? Where do you think they fall short?
Well, I think there are a lot of good reasons to take seriously Marx's critique of liberalism, and I want to be clear. There's a chapter in the book on Marx where I talk about many of his criticisms of liberalism, and I point out that a lot of them have not been taken seriously enough by liberals, and they have not been taken seriously enough by liberal socialists, for that matter. And in the conclusion of the book, I point out that my own articulation of liberal socialism will look a lot more Marxist than anything that's come before, because I think that Marx is a profound thinker with a lot to teach us, especially now, in an age of very ugly reaction. But I think that the kind of core Marxist criticisms that one can bring up of liberalism are twofold. The first one is that liberals have not taken adequate account of the way that economic power is a very formidable system of power in its own right and instantiates a wide array of systems of domination, even in what looks like a purportedly free society. And this is an argument that Marx himself developed from a very, very early age, arguably even prior to his classic essay on the Jewish question, and certainly in Capital. Just to give an example, in Capital Volume 1, Marx actually echoes a lot of what Mill himself had to say when he claims, look, liberals talk a big game about the importance of representative government, basic rights for all, freedom of expression, and Marx says that's all good, right? There are good reasons to cherish those kinds of things. But all that falls immediately away as soon as workers enter onto the factory floor. Where one once again sees all the old nasty despotism reintroduce itself, and what we get are, to use Elizabeth Anderson's terminology, something that looks a lot like a private dictatorship that emerges. That's extremely contrary to what liberals themselves should believe, right? At least according to Marx, and I think he's right about that. A second criticism that many Marxists have made of liberals, including liberal egalitarians, and I think this is a very important one, is that liberals have always had a very hard time understanding capitalism as a systemic global totality. Now, some liberals have understood this. I would argue actually that the neoliberals understood very well. But by and large, when they do understand this, they almost invariably tend to treat it as a good thing. That we live in a global systematic totality governed by the capitalist mode of production. By contrast, egalitarian liberals, like, say, John Rawls, for example, tend to focus their reformist efforts or their concerns at the level of the nation state and just disregard the fact that you can't really understand the political economy of the nation state without recognizing how it's integrated in a broader array of global forms of mute compulsion. And I think, again, this Marxist critique of liberal egalitarians is a very, very sound one and extremely contemporary, since I think it's still a very serious weakness on the part of the liberal egalitarian and liberal socialist tradition. Now, saying that, what I point out in the book is that there's also been, I think, a caricatured understanding of what Marx has to say about liberalism that has kind of eked its way into the broader culture and created a lot of problems. So the kind of caricatured version of Marxism that's kind of made its way into the culture is that Marx is just a unambiguous and unrelenting critic of liberalism. Just had nothing good to say about it from start to finish. And what I point out in the book is, again, historically, that's simply not true, right? Marx began his career as a young Hegelian who was committed to liberal democracy and certainly to a republican system of government being instituted in Germany. As he radicalized at quite an early age, he didn't drop his commitment to the importance of things like freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and certainly not to pushing for universal suffrage for all, which was a left liberal and, for that matter, a socialist kind of project through the 19th century. He just continuously argued that there were limitations to arguing for these forms of bourgeois freedom, since even though they were good and even though they were something to endorse, certainly where they weren't present, they didn't go far enough in securing real emancipation by transforming material conditions. And, he seems to have carried on with this view over the course of his long life, right? Marx always campaigned for things like freedom of assembly and the expansion of suffrage, especially for the workers. And in the Critique of the Gotha program, you see him actually make some quite interesting claims about the relationship of Marxist socialism to liberalism. So he says that there's this utopian socialist idea that sounds a lot like what you see in some spaces online, which suggests that socialism is completely different from liberalism, and that a transition to a socialist or communist society is going to be carried out through some kind of millenarian break, right? We're going to essentially year one it. There's going to be before the revolution and then after the revolution, and after the revolution, all will be different. And Marx points out in the Critique of the Gotha program that this is both profoundly undialectical and profoundly ahistorical, which is what makes it utopian. He says, look, any socialist society that's going to emerge out of the womb of bourgeois society is going to be fundamentally stamped by many features of that society, and consequently, they are going to carry on for a long period of time, right? The different features of what he calls bourgeois recht or bourgeois right are going to be present in any socialist society we create. It's only going to be after a very long period of time when we sufficiently develop the means of production so that we have a superabundance of goods that we can do away with the institutions of bourgeois right or bourgeois recht and ascribe upon our banners from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And Marx does not establish a timeline from when that's going to occur. So even though I do not suggest that Marx is in any way, shape, or form a kind of fellow traveler with liberal socialism, or that he's would endorse liberal socialism if he were alive today, I do point out that his views on liberalism are a lot more complicated, as indeed they must be, for anyone who's a dialectical materialist, than just emphatic rejection.
Let's get into defining liberal socialism. What do you see as, what would a working definition be? Like, what are the core principles of this idea of liberal socialism?
Sure. Well, I argue that there are three core principles in the book. The first is a commitment to what I call methodological collectivism and normative individualism. Now, those are very academic terms, but to make a long story very short, liberal socialists are methodological collectivists in the sense that we reject the atomistic view of society as consisting of more or less isolated individuals, unconcerned with each other's business and competing with each other to maximize their own self-interest. Without a doubt, there are people who look like this and who act like this, but every liberal socialist agrees with Aristotle, and for that matter with Marx, that human beings are also invariably social animals, and that we prefer to live in society. It's our natural habitat to interact with one another, and acknowledging that from an anthropological, and for that matter, from a excuse me, a sociological standpoint is absolutely necessary in order to have a good understanding of what human beings are and what kind of values are appropriate to them. And that brings me to my second point, which is that liberal socialists are all, by and large, normative individualists in addition to being methodological collectivists. And what I mean by this is that while all liberal socialists acknowledge that human beings are social animals and interact with one another, they nonetheless think that it is the well-being of actually existing individuals and potentially future generations that is of moral concern, or to use Derek Parfit's term, what matters. And this is important because any liberal socialist would follow Marx and saying the kind of reified abstractions that many people on the right, for example, project as having independent normative value, the nation, the people, the Volk. None of that is actually as important as the concrete needs of the actual people that make up the world or potentially future generations. And this is important, of course, because all liberal socialists would say you can't sacrifice people in the here and now, or for that matter, abridge their fundamental rights for the sake of national glory, right? Or the expansion of Germany eastwards to acquire Lebensraum as part of a great project. You get the idea, right? Then the second principle I argue that all liberal socialists are committed to is a developmental rather than an acquisitive ethic. And these are terms I take again from the great Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson. So an acquisitive ethic is one that's very associated with this kind of possessive individualist anthropology and social vision, right? This idea that human beings, again, are fundamentally self-interested and competitive, and consequently, the right kind of ethic for them is one where they pursue hedonistic gratification of their basic needs. Or if you want to put it in utilitarian language, the best thing for a human being is to get as much stuff as possible, to get as much utility gratification as possible, right? Liberal socialists, by and large, reject that by saying, actually, and again, they follow Aristotle and Marx here, of much more importance for most people and much better for their long-term development is the refinement or cultivation of our human capacities, right? Just to use, kind of Rawls for a second, since he's a big part of the book. Rawls, for example, argues for what he calls an Aristotelian principle, which holds that by and large human beings enjoy exercising our capacities, and the more developed those capacities become, and the more challenging the task that we set those capacities to, the more pleasure we get out of their cultivation and their exercise. So just to give his example, very few of us would find counting the blades of grass on a field to be a particularly rich and meaningful life. And if you were the kind of person that committed himself to counting the blades of grass on a plane, you yourself would probably think, boy, oh boy, do I need to get a life, right? Find something else to do with my time. But, a lot of us get a lot of pleasure out of thinking, I'm going to become a better father, or I'm going to try to be a better friend, or I'm going to become a better husband, or I'm going to write a better book, maybe even the next great American novel, right? Or I'm going to become the best YouTuber I possibly can, and kind of social media political analyst, because I get a lot of gratification about that. And so from a liberal socialist standpoint, developing these basic capacities in cooperation with others is a much higher kind of good than just gratifying our hedonic urges, the way that some liberals have thought. And then the last and most basic principle, or most encompassing principle, is a commitment to the achievement of economic democracy within a liberal democratic framework that respects basic liberal rights, accepting, I should say, an expansive right to private property or private ownership of the means of production. And in addition, most liberal socialists would say not only are we under a moral obligation to try to achieve economic democracy, because many of them were quite pronounced feminists, they would also insist that it's important to achieve a democracy within the family as well, or include the family within the kinds of economic units that's important for us to be normatively concerned about.
So I had three more questions. I know we only have maybe 20, 25 minutes here. So you start the book out with a quote from John Rawls' Theory of Justice, 1971. Why did you include that specific quote? And I won't read the whole thing because it's kind of lengthy, but it goes into what is just and unjust is the way the institutions deal with natural facts. So, what was the reason for including that quote?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually, the first person to pick up on that. So, thanks. I've been waiting a long time for that question. So, I really like that quote for a few different reasons, right? One is again because I spend an awful lot of time engaging with right wingers, and without a doubt, one of the most common ways they try to defend inequality is by naturalizing inequality and suggesting that any attempt to ameliorate inequality is tantamount to trying to undo nature itself, right? You see this even amongst several very, very, very prominent liberals like Ludwig von Mises. The argument being, well, take your pick, right? Women are not as intelligent, are not as capable as men by nature. Itself an extremely disputable claim. Consequently, they are, destined to exclusively be concerned with home life, right? This is an argument that goes all the way back to Aristotle. You can find iterations of it in John Locke. You can find iterations of it, of course, on the online right now. Some people just work far harder than others or far smarter than others, and they're going to become rich by virtue of this. That's simply the way nature is. Who are you to interfere with this? And what Rawls does very effectively, in a way that's kind of in line or genealogically connected to what Paine and Wollstonecraft did, it says, yeah, but so what from a moral standpoint? Yes, it is without a doubt the case that human beings are different, and some people have more developed natural talents than others, and some people are better at making money than others. But why does that matter from a moral standpoint? He says, the reality is that everyone accepts that there are inequalities between people by nature. That's just a fact. But what justice is concerned about is how social institutions respond to those facts, which is an entirely different set of issues than just asking yourself biologically whether some people are better at hockey than others, or some people are more likely to do well on a math test than others. And of course, Rawls has a very elaborate argument to show that social institutions should not care very much about natural inequalities because they're the result of morally arbitrary circumstances. So you happen to win a genetic lottery and you're better at math than the next person. So what? Right? Pat yourself on the back for a few seconds, recognize there, but for the grace of God go I, and realize that the person who is not as gifted at math or other things as you isn't somehow responsible for that. And consequently, they should not be penalized for not having the same kind of advantages that others might have purely by virtue of being lucky in the game of life.
I also wanted to ask you, I know this book got very high marks from Samuel Moyn, who I'm also a big fan of. And I was wondering, do you see this book as maybe in dialogue with or possibly a companion to his recent book, Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times, which for people that don't know, deals with the liberal intellectuals of the Cold War era, from Isaiah Berlin to Karl Popper to Lionel Trilling. And that book sort of argues that the Cold War liberals went away from the moral core of the Enlightenment and that form of liberalism towards sort of this preserving individual liberty at all costs mentality during the Cold War that may have created a lot of problems and helped create illiberal values in our time. Do you see your book as having any overlaps with Samuel's book, Liberalism Against Itself?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I have to say, I'm a huge fan of Sam Moyn. He's been a major influence on my way of thinking about things since 2011 when I first read his book, The Last Utopia on human rights. And I just think that he's extremely deep and very thoughtful scholar. And he's a great guy also, right? Very, very generous with his time, very generous, as you pointed out with the blurb, with his evaluations. And very supportive of those of us who are on the left end of the liberal spectrum. And I should point out when Sam was generous enough to come on to give them an argument with Ben Burgess, and I was also an interlocutor, I asked him what his own political convictions were, and he said that he thought liberal socialism sounded like a pretty good idea, right? So there's a reason, why I tend to agree with him about a lot of things. But in terms of that book you wrote specifically, I thought it was extremely revelatory and
I hope
extremely
I gave a
important.
good outline of the book as well. I hope I didn't get anything wrong there. It's been a while since I've read it.
Oh yeah, absolutely right. I thought you did a great job. But what Sam points out, and I think very rightly, is there is this kind of Cold War narrative that has influenced both left and right, which holds that liberalism is fundamentally a reactionary, deceptic, uh, unambitious, technocratic kind of worldview that is far, far closer to conservatism than it is to any kind of leftism or progressivism. Uh, and Sam points out, I think quite rightly, that that's simply not true historically, right? Liberalism came into the world as a revolutionary creed, if not the most revolutionary creed that the world has ever seen, right? And I want to point out Marx himself always appreciated that, right? In the Communist Manifesto, where he and Engels pointed out that the bourgeois class was without a doubt the most revolutionary class that history had ever given birth to, and had enormous amount of respect for the role it was playing in overturning the Ancien regime and replacing feudalism with capitalism, right? So I think Sam's on very, very solid ground there. And he points out that at their most ambitious, many of the left liberals that he also talks about in the book, and people discuss this a little bit less, really did believe that it would be possible to create a society that looks a lot like what socialists want, right? A society where freedom, equality, and solidarity for all weren't just abstract terms, but really meant something, right? And he points out that whatever else you want to say about mid-century social democracy, in many respects, they came closer to achieving attractive visions of a society where equality, liberty, and solidarity for all are respected than almost anyone else, even though Sam himself is very critical of the limitations of social democracy, and so am I, right? And then he says, as a result of the Cold War, unfortunately, liberalism was not co-opted because these streams were always there, but became defined by these much more conservative, much more mayorist, much more cautious forms of liberalism that essentially whitewashed away all this more revolutionary, visionary, ambitious history, kind of excommunicating people like, say, Hegel and Rousseau from the liberal club, and not drawing influence from people like Marx and the socialist tradition, the way that many early 20th century liberals, like say John Dewey, would be very happy or interested in engaging with socialism. And Sam points out, I think very rightly, that this turn to a cautious, sclerotic, deflationary version of liberalism has been a disaster for liberals, oddly enough. And this is what I kind of point out, building upon him. The weird thing is that this defensive, cautious crouch that many liberals push themselves into in order to define themselves against communism, in many ways was the least cautious thing they could have done, because it meant that for in the eyes of a lot of people, there's nothing inspiring, nothing interesting, nothing visionary or hopeful about liberalism any longer. And very shortly after the Cold War, we know what happens, right? Liberals become associated all around the world with elitism, remove a kind of technocratic disinterest in the people that they purport to govern, and right-wing populists come along and after a much more sweeping, much more ideologically ambitious vision of the world. Now, I think it's a vision that's horrifying in terms of its connotations, but many people are highly responsive to this because there is truth to what some of the right-wing populists say when they claim that liberals are removed from the concerns of ordinary people, when they claim that a lot of liberals don't have much connection to the values of the people that they purport to govern. We're all familiar with this story, right? And I argue in the book that consequently, if liberals are going to get their mojo back, we need to be ambitious in defining ourselves in opposition to these right-wing streams of populism, and offer a vision of the world that is attractive and offers a sense of hope to the millions of people, if not tens of millions of people, who have been dispossessed by various forms of neoliberalism, inequality, and capitalism for decades now.
Yeah, in that regard, I think your book's very important because I think one of the biggest points that Sam is making in Liberalism Against Itself is that right now, in our current moment, especially when that book was written a few years ago, there's this sort of nostalgia some within the establishment have for Cold War liberalism. And I think it's showing now that that's not going to be enough for anyone to the left of, say, MAGA for them to win out in the end and to seize the day. And I think you're providing maybe an opening for us to seize the day with this book.
Yeah, thanks. And that's kind of what I was hoping to do in a lot of respects, right? I mean, this book is a retrieval, not a defense. And I call it a retrieval because, as I point out in the conclusion at length, I
Well, you
hope.
have your criticisms of it too, but
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of problems with liberal socialism, but I do think it's an attractive idea. And I do think it's the kind of thing that people to the left, on the left end of the spectrum, need to be thinking about when confronted by an aggressive but charismatic form of right-wing populism. So just to come down to earth for a few seconds now, you see people like Matt McManus and Noah Smith, all these kind of centrist liberals who have been in charge of the Democratic Party ideologically for a very long time. Not formally in charge, obviously, but I'm talking about in terms of setting its kind of tone and ideological agenda. While this way of thinking has resulted in two losses against Trump, big losses, right, in terms of their consequences, and one very thin electoral Pyrrhic victory, right? And I say Pyrrhic because obviously Trump is in the business of undoing Biden's very limited legacy right now, right? So you can't point to centrist Cold War style liberalism and say, all we need to do is get the formula right and eventually things will get back on track. We've tried this experiment many times now and it hasn't delivered results. And I would submit that one of the reasons it hasn't delivered results in terms of being able to successfully confront MAGA is when people like Donald Trump characterize liberals as out of touch, unconcerned with ordinary people, distant from the kind of values of people who work for a living, he's not wrong, right? The problem, of course, being that MAGA itself is now absolutely beholden to a certain conception of oligarchic society that is working very hard to implement. And the implementation of its vision is going to be a disaster for ordinary people the world over, not to mention future generations that are going to be saddled with the enormous consequence of not doing enough to combat man-made climate change, right? So I think that it's time to say RIP to Cold War liberalism, recognize that it was an uninspired idea in theory that has proven extremely uninspiring in practice. And we're all better off without it, right? It was a bad idea, badly implemented. So it's time to say goodbye.
I know we're running short on time here. I just had two more questions. And the first,
Sure.
I don't want to cover it like too much. I just want to get your brief thoughts. I think there would be some, especially sort of from an anti-colonial or global South viewpoint, that would look at liberal socialism's roots in European thought and say that it risks overlooking liberalism's complicity over the years in imperial hierarchies. How would you respond to those critiques?
Yeah, I would actually agree with them, right? I mean, this is one of the serious limitations of liberal socialism that I bring up in the book, deeply inspired by actually self-described black radical liberals like Charles Mills, but also Marxists, black Marxists like Cedric Robinson or the Italian Marxist-Leninist Domenico Lacerdo. All of them point out that, look, even well-meaning liberals, and I would add liberal socialists like John Stuart Mill, found it very, very hard to resist the allure of empire, right? John Stuart Mill, from any left standpoint, looks like a pretty attractive fellow. I think if you actually read him carefully, right? He had nothing but praise for a lot of versions of socialism, identified as a socialist, was for the enfranchisement of women and for women's equality, was an abolitionist when it mattered, right? A lot of good things about him. But he's also a vehement imperialist and suggested that a kind of benign despotism was necessary for the third world until they could reach a level of maturity where they could govern themselves. And his thinking was by no means atypical, even amongst liberal socialists, right? I point out that, for instance, Edward Bernstein, right? Important figure in the German SPD. I think actually quite an admirable figure if you think about his critiques of German militarism in Europe. Had nothing to say, and even was kind of a soft proponent of German imperialism. And, you know, where a lot of liberal socialists didn't defend empire, they just had nothing really to say about it. You know, they kind of adopted this Rawlsian attitude of agnosticism or ideal theory, where they just kind of pretended that all that didn't matter and it's not really there. I think that that's a serious mistake. A 21st century liberal socialism, again, is going to need to recognize how capitalism is a global systemic totality and aligned with this propensity to go global. Is this propensity to always develop imperialist forms of imposition in order to export the capitalist mode of production to countries or to nations where the people there just don't want it.
Very last thing I wanted to touch upon, and I mentioned this to you in our DMs before we, set this all up. I noticed that Richard Rorty is absent, and when I brought that up, you said I didn't have enough time to cover him in the book. But where do you situate Richard Rorty? Because I actually think I mean, since he has passed away, I think in the early 2000s, people only bring him up in relation to, oh, he predicted Trump or, the meme now that that's become. But I think he was actually very sharp and may have overlaps with the idea of liberal socialism. And I think he's a much more important figure, and I hope he gets rediscovered by a lot of people.
Well, just for you, maybe I'll pitch an article to Liberal Currents about Richard Rorty, kind of reading him that way, because I agree with you. Look, I have serious problems with Rorty's epistemology. I actually have some sympathy for variants of cognitive pragmatism, a la Robert Brandom, but I'm not entirely sure that some of Rorty's, so I say, more eccentric views on epistemology are ones I can get behind. And I think sometimes he wasn't even sure that people were going to take them all that seriously. I think that he had a kind of imp-like sense of humor, and he really liked kind of pricking the pretensions of a lot of analytical philosophers. And I am, by and large, quite okay with that project. But not when he would say things like, well, maybe it's time for us to abandon the idea of an individual mind and recognize that while it was useful to talk about individual mind at some point, now it's important for us to talk about collective mind, since we've semanticized our approach to the philosophy of mind. When he says things like that, because he's such a good writer, sometimes I'm like, then I'm like, wait, what? So hey, I don't have a mind. It's just a collective mind. No, I don't think I can get that far. In terms of his politics, though, I'm actually willing to say that he deserves a lot more credit than he is given, in part for just what you mentioned, right? I mean, if you read Achieving Our Country, he more or less says a couple of years from now, you're going to get a despotic right-wing figure that's going to appear, who's going to talk about how people should be tired of all these bitchy, puritanical, postmodern professors who are constantly engaged in the America Sucks sweepstakes, and he's going to be able to ride the wave of animosity that generates to quasi-oligarchic power. Well, coming from the 1990s, that looks pretty far-sighted to me, and given how far-sighted it is, it's probably a good reason to take some of his other political conclusions seriously. I think that Rorty was pretty clear in not just Achieving Our Country, but Philosophy and Social Hope, the collection of essays he wrote on political philosophy, and contingency, irony, and solidarity, that he's pretty comfortable with playing at the intersection of liberalism and socialism. He was always very clear that he kind of associated very closely with the politics of Dissent magazine. People like Michael Walzer or Irving Howe. Irving Howe also wrote a famous essay, Liberalism and Socialism, Articles of Conciliation. And I don't think Rorty would get too hung up on analytically precise labels for his politics, in no small part because of his pragmatic outlook, right? I think that he would probably say, look, the reality is that my politics boils down to something that all socialists and all liberals care about, which is that we should make our societies less cruel than they are right now. And we should reorient our hopes from these transcendent sets of concerns towards trying to create a society that will be way, way better for our great-great-grandchildren, I think is what he said. And he was pretty clear that liberal democracy does a fairly good job of protecting people's basic rights, allowing people the space to cultivate their private concerns, whether that's, reading Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard or writing bad poetry, as it were. But he was also very clear that we could do a lot more economically for the destitute of this country. So I think that he would definitely belong in the liberal socialist canon. So would John Dewey, for that matter, right? The figure who is deeply influenced by. like I said, I was going to add a chapter on Dewey, and then I was going to throw some Rorty in there. And then I was told by my publisher, "You're already at 110,000 words, which is 10,000 more than we've given you, than we told you to have. So cut some stuff." And so sadly, they just they didn't get in there.
Do you
But
think
I'll
there's anywhere that like a Dewey or a Rorty you may have a conflict with them of sorts in terms of how they think about how society should be structured?
yes, in some respects. Okay, so
But
I
I
mean,
think I mentioned that because I think there's affinities I can see, but I could also see where there's conflict.
yeah, absolutely. I think that some liberal socialists, like Rawls, for example, would be a lot more dogged in arguing that ideal theoretic concerns mean that these are the two principles of justice that we need to institute, and that a just society will institute them in a pretty respectful way, and establish a liberal socialist regime or a property owning democracy regime that has these kind of recognizable features. I think that Rorty, well, actually, I don't think, I know Rorty would be sympathetic towards something like Rawlsian liberal socialism, um, or Walserian or Deweyan liberal socialism, because he said so on numerous occasions. But I do think that he would look at Rawls or someone like Rawls and say, uh, this idea that there are just one set of principles that we should try to institute as faithfully as possible does a disservice to the experimental approach that we should take to politics. It's still too ideologically driven, too attached to these kinds of transcendental projects of working out morality at an ideal level and then trying to apply it to the real world. He'd probably say we should instead try to institute reformist or ameliorist kinds of social programs, expanding democracy, for example, into the workplace, or democratic
Do you
principles in
think
the workplace.
maybe he was more of like a cautious reformist than maybe some liberal socialists would be?
I don't know about that. I mean, again, he's always liked Dissent magazine. He always identified with Irving Howe and Michael Walzer. And he certainly wasn't cautious in a lot of respects, right? I mean, he had
That's
no
true.
problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he was not the kind of guy who would sit there and be like, we should always aim for the mushy middle because that's the best place to be. What I think he would say is we can try radical experiments, uh, but then we need to recognize that those experiments might fail. And rather than being ideologically rigid about trying and then trying again, we should move on and do something else. And I think you can really see this in his attitude towards Marxism, for example, right? I mean, he was very overt about the fact that for a leftist, he had never really bothered to crack open Das Kapital. He'd always had a copy of it sitting around and was planning to get to it one day. And then he just couldn't be arsed to do so because he thought, why bother? And by the 1990s, he was like, well, that has been tried and it's failed. And that's not a reason to give up on leftism or a progressive project, but move on, change the topic to something else. And I disagree with him there. I think that there are good reasons to be committed to things like, again, capital T truth and capital J justice in a way that I think he would be a little bit allergic to. Uh, does that make him more or less radical? I think it really depends on what you mean. It would probably make him potentially less dogged politically, but the kind of hyper skepticism that he would adopt towards things, I think many people characterize as quite radical, given our intuitions about justice and truth.
Well, listen, if you ever do pitch or get an article about Rorty out there through Liberal Currents or another publication, let me know. We'll have to do a longer form on Rorty. So, anything else you want to say in closing, just for my audience? What do you want them to get out of this conversation and the book?
Sure. Well, look, I want to be really clear that this book was written as a retrieval, not a defense. Some people have sometimes accused me of kind of copying out that way by being like, "Oh, you don't believe what you've written about." But really, it's quite the opposite, right? I'm trying to be very clear that I think liberal socialism has a lot of virtues to it, and that I personally think it's the right philosophy for the moment. But just because it has a lot of virtues and just because it's a good philosophy for the moment doesn't mean it's not deeply flawed. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of these guys fail to get their ideas off the ground. Uh, and it's not just because of a couple of tiny problems here or there. And so, if people are interested in liberal socialism, or they want to be critical of liberal socialism, what I encourage them to do is learn a little bit about it. Ask yourself why these failures happen, and then do what I do, which is maybe adopt the kind of Beckettian dictum, which is if liberal socialism has failed before, then we'll fail again, and then eventually we'll succeed.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you again, Matt McManus, for coming on Parallax Views.
Yeah, thanks, man. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, please consider supporting me on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.